Thank you, Tom. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. It's actually not my first visit. I think I gave a colloquium to the psychology department about 20 years ago. And I also consider myself a kind of honorary member of the Wellesley community because I taught at MIT for 21 years, during which time many Wellesley students took my courses, worked in my lab. Many of my MIT students took courses at, or at least some of them, at least one of them, took a course at Wellesley. And so it's a true pleasure to be here. A few years ago, I wrote a chapter on taboo language, on swearing and other forms of offensive speech, which began with the following words. It's no coincidence that freedom of speech is enshrined in the first of the 10 amendments to the Constitution that make up the Bill of Rights, because freedom of speech is the foundation of democracy. It didn't take long for a historian to write to me saying, actually, it is a coincidence. Originally, the framers had framed 12 amendments, of which the one guaranteeing free speech was third. The first two, which dealt with how congressmen were paid and other housekeeping issues, failed to pass, which resulted in the third amendment being promoted to first. Well, it serves me right for assuming that history provides us with neat symbolism that makes for cute chapter openings. Still, I could have written, it's fitting that the constitutional guarantee of free speech is the first of the 10 amendments, because free speech is indeed the foundation of democracy, and I hope to remind you this evening much else that is worthwhile in life. More than 2 centuries after freedom of speech was enshrined in the First Amendment, that right is very much in the news. Campus speech codes, disinvited commencement speakers, jailed performance artists, exiled leakers, a blogger condemned to 1,000 lashes by one of our closest allies, and the massacre of a dozen French cartoonists have forced the democratic world to examine the roots of its commitment to free speech. Is free speech merely a symbolic talisman, like a national flag or motto? Is it just one of many values that we trade off against each other? Was Pope Francis right when he said that, quote, you cannot make fun of the faith of others, unquote? May universities muzzle some students to protect the sensibilities of others? Did the Charlie Hebdo cartoonists, quote, cross a line that separates free speech from toxic talk, as the dean of a school of journalism recently opined? Or is free speech fundamental, a right which, if not absolute, should be abrogated only in carefully circumscribed cases? The answer that I hope to persuade you of this evening is that free speech is indeed fundamental. It's important, I think, to remind ourselves why and to have the reasons at our fingertips when that right is called into question. The first reason is that the very thing we're doing when we ask whether free speech is fundamental, namely evaluating and exchanging ideas, presupposes that we have the right to evaluate and exchange ideas. In talking about free speech, or anything else, we're talking. We're not settling our disagreements by arm wrestling, or a beauty contest, or a pistol duel. Unless you're willing to discredit yourself by declaring, in the sarcastic words of Nat Hentoff, free speech for me, but not for thee, then as soon as you show up to a debate to argue against free speech, you've lost it. Second, by the way, I should mention at the outset that although the title of the talk that I gave to Tom was 3 reasons to defend free speech, I'm actually going to lay out 4. So the top, it's three reasons plus 1. Anyway, you just heard the first one. Second, free speech is the only way to acquire knowledge about the world. Perhaps the greatest discovery in human history, one that is logically prior to every other discovery, is that all of our traditional sources of belief are in fact generators of error and should be dismissed as sources of knowledge. These include faith, revelation, dogma, authority, charisma, augury, prophecy, intuition, clairvoyance, conventional wisdom, and that warm, invigorating glow of subjective certainty. How then can we know? Other than by proving mathematical and logical theorems, which are not about the material world, The answer is the process that Karl Popper called conjecture and refutation. We come up with ideas about the nature of reality, and this involves the combinatorial powers of human cognition that Tom mentioned in his kind introduction. And then we test those ideas against that reality, allowing the world to falsify the mistaken ones. The conjecture part of this formula, of course, presupposes the exercise of free speech. We offer conjectures without any prior assurance that they are correct. It's only by brooding ideas and seeing which ones withstand attempts to refute them that we acquire knowledge. Once this realization sank in during the scientific revolution, the Age of Reason, and the Enlightenment, the traditional understanding of the world was decimated. Everyone knows that the discovery that the Earth revolves around the sun rather than vice versa had to overcome fierce resistance from common sense and ecclesiastical authority. But the Copernican revolution was just the first event in a cataclysm that would make our current understanding of the world unrecognizable to our ancestors. We know that the belief systems of all the world's traditional religions and cultures, their theories of the origins of life, humans, and societies, are factually mistaken. We know, but our ancestors did not, that humans belong to a single species of African primate that developed agriculture, government, and writing late in its history. We know that our species is a tiny twig of a genealogical tree that embraces all living things and that emerged from prebiotic chemicals almost 4 billion years ago. We know that we live on a planet that revolves around one of 100 billion stars in our galaxy, which is one of 100 billion galaxies in a 13.8 billion year old universe, possibly one of a vast number of universes. We know that our intuitions about space, time, matter, and causation are incommensurable with the nature of reality on scales that are very large and very small. We know that the laws governing the physical world, including accidents, disease, and other misfortunes, have no goals that pertain to human well-being. That is, there is no such thing as fate, providence, karma, spells, curses, augury, divine retribution, or answered prayers, though the discrepancy between the laws of probability and the workings of cognition may explain why so many people believe there are. And we know that we did not always know these things, that the beloved convictions of every time and culture may be decisively falsified, doubtless including some we hold today. Free speech was not just central to the development of knowledge in the history of humanity. It may be central to the development of knowledge in any intelligent species. In his brilliant book, The Beginning of Infinity, the physicist David Deutsch argues that conjecture and refutation is the only way, in principle, that knowledge can be acquired. If he is right, we can rule out that staple of science fiction, the advanced race of extraterrestrials with a higher form of intelligence. There is only one form of intelligence, Deutsch argues, and modern humans have it. A combination of the ability to conjecture hypotheses, which is part of our evolved cognitive makeup, again, the combinatorial power of cognition, and the willingness to let the world refute them, which is an accomplishment of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. If so, the freedom to advance ideas is not just the parochial idea of Homo sapiens on planet Earth. It may be an ideal of all intelligent beings. A third reason that free speech is foundational to human flourishing is that it is essential to democracy and a bulwark against tyranny. The most pressing historical question of the 20th century is how monstrous totalitarian regimes, particularly those of Stalin, Hitler, Mao, and Imperial Japan, came into existence. There are a number of popular conjectures, such as the libertarian hypothesis that societies with extensive social welfare systems and copious government regulation are likely to slide down a slippery slope into totalitarianism. It's an interesting hypothesis with a major flaw, namely, nothing of the sort has ever happened. Instead, fascist and communist regimes came to power through violent intimidation. In every case, groups of armed fanatics used violence to silence or intimidate their critics and adversaries. Even the apparently democratic election of the Nazis in 1933 was preceded by years of intimidation, murder, and violent mayhem. And once in power, totalitarians criminalized any criticism of the regime. There's a systematic reason why dictators brook no dissent. The immiserated subjects of a tyrannical regime are not deluded that they are happy. And if tens of millions of disaffected citizens act together, no regime has the brute force to resist them. The reason that citizens don't resist their overlords en masse is that they lack what logicians call common knowledge, the knowledge that everyone else shares their knowledge. Not just that I know something and you know something, but I know that you know it, and I know that you know that I know that you know it, and you know that I know that you know it, and so on. Common knowledge is a prerequisite to coordinating behavior for mutual benefit. Two friends will show up at the same cafe at a given time only if each one knows that the other knows that both know that the other knows about the appointment. Now, in the case of civil resistance, people will expose themselves to the risk of reprisal by a despotic regime only if they know that others are exposing themselves to that risk at the same time and that the others know that they know. Indeed, in computer simulations of artificial societies, the sociologist Michael Macy has shown that open channels of communication are essential in preventing unpopular beliefs, those that no one believes but that no one dares deny, from becoming entrenched. If true believers can punish skeptics in these computer simulations, then a minority view can take over. But if skeptics can sample the beliefs of their compatriots, then collective delusions will tend to unravel. Now, the common knowledge that emboldens collective action is created by public information, like a broadcasted statement. The story of the emperor's new clothes illustrates the logic. When the little boy shouted that the emperor was naked, he was not telling the crowd anything that they didn't already know, anything they couldn't see with their own eyeballs. But he was changing the state of their knowledge nonetheless, because now everyone knew that everyone else knew that everyone else knew that the emperor was naked. And that common knowledge, in this technical sense, emboldened them to challenge the emperor's authority with their laughter. The story, as well as illustrating the convoluted logic of common knowledge in an easily grasped example, also shows us why humor is no laughing matter. Why satire and ridicule, even when puerile and tasteless, are terrifying to autocrats and protected by democracies, something that, of course, is very much in the public discussion, given the massacre of the Charlie Hebdo cartoonists. Satire can stealthily challenge assumptions that are second nature to an audience by forcing them to see that those assumptions lead to consequences that everyone recognizes are absurd. And that's why humor so often has served as an accelerant to social progress. 18th century wise guys like Voltaire, Swift, and Johnson ridiculed the wars, oppressions, and cruel practices of their day. In the 1960s, comedians and artists portrayed racists as thick-witted Neanderthals and Vietnam hawks and nuclear Cold Warriors as amoral psychopaths. The Soviet Union and its satellites also had a rich underground current of satire, as in the common definition of the two Cold War ideologies. Capitalism is the exploitation of man by man. Communism is the exact opposite. Now, we use barbed speech to undermine not just political leaders, but the petty oppressors of everyday life. The tyrannical boss, the sanctimonious preacher, the blowhard at the bar, the neighborhood enforcer of stifling norms. Now, granted, it may seem outlandish to link an issue that we are parochially concerned with, American campus freedom, which by historical and global standards is still admirably high, to the world's brutal regimes. But the connection is not that far-fetched. A few months ago, I addressed the Oslo Freedom Forum, a kind of TED for political dissidents. I met people who escaped from North Korea by walking across the Gobi Desert in winter, people who were jailed for a single tweet, people whose families were thrown in prison because of their political activity. So these stories put the relatively minor restrictions on campus speech in perspective. But the American commitment to unfettered speech, unrivaled even by our democratic allies in Europe, stands as a beacon of inspiration to the world's dissidents, one of the few features of the American brand that still commands global admiration. More than one speaker at the forum singled out speech codes and other restrictions on expression in the United States as a worrisome development. The final reason that free speech is fundamental to civilized societies, and one that is the most relevant to perhaps this kind of venue, an American college, is that free speech is inseparable from the mission of higher education. Today's universities are racked with debates on curricula, admissions, funding, pedagogy, sexuality, and much else. And all of them ultimately hinge on an understanding of what colleges and universities are for. As the song says, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. But I've often been astonished at how professors, deans, and even college and university presidents can't come up with a coherent statement about what the mission of a university or a college is. When called upon to do so, they go all misty and babbling in incoherent platitudes. A good example is a recent best-selling book by the literary critic William Deresiewicz called Excellent Sheep. When excerpted in the New Republic, it became the most read article in the century-long history of that magazine. In that scathing critique of elite colleges and universities, Deresiewicz ventures that the goal of a university education is for students to, quote, build a self, which he explicates as follows. Quote, it is only through the act of establishing communication between the mind and the heart, the mind and experience, that you become an individual, a unique being, a soul. This vision, to the extent that I can make sense of it, is troubling. I've been a professor for more than 3 decades, but I have no idea how to get students to acquire a self or to build a soul. Sorry. They don't teach it in graduate school. And we've never evaluated a candidate for hiring or promotion by how well he or she can accomplish it. Indeed, if acquiring a self has something to do with adult responsibility, moral sophistication, or the ability to reason through the inherent conflicts in the human condition, contemporary colleges and universities are falling over themselves to prevent students from acquiring one. The students at elite colleges and universities today are encouraged to prioritize music, athletics, and other form of recreation over their academic duties. They may be disciplined by an administrative board with medieval standards of jurisprudence, pressured to sign a kindness pledge that's suitable for kindergarten, muzzled by speech codes that would not pass the giggle test if challenged on First Amendment grounds, and publicly shamed for private emails that express controversial opinions. In any case, the commonly expressed idea that a university education is a form of soulcraft is not as anodyne as it first seems. In fact, I find it kind of creepy, because it licenses moralistic propaganda and a condescending disregard for students' critical faculties. I say that student souls are none of our business. A concern with soulcraft distracts us from a more coherent, defensible, and practicable understanding of the mission of a college or university, one in which free speech is an inseparable part. Let me be specific. Though I profess no ability to shape the souls of my students, I think there are some things that I and my colleagues are qualified to do. It seems to me that educated people should know something about the 13 billion year prehistory of our species and the basic laws governing the physical and living world, including our bodies and brains. Students should grasp the timeline of human history, from the dawn of agriculture to the present. They should be exposed to the diversity of human cultures and the major systems of belief and value with which people have made sense of their lives. They should know about the formative events in human history, including the blunders we can hope not to repeat. They should understand the principles behind democratic governance and the rule of law. They should know how to appreciate works of fiction and art as sources of aesthetic pleasure and as impetuses to reflect on the human condition. On top of this knowledge, a liberal education should make certain habits of rationality second nature. Educated people should be able to express complex ideas in clear writing and speech. They should appreciate that objective knowledge is a precious commodity and know how to distinguish vetted fact from superstition, rumor, and unexamined conventional wisdom. They should know how to reason logically and statistically, avoiding the fallacies and biases to which the untutored mind is vulnerable. They should think causally rather than magically and know what it takes to distinguish causation from correlation and coincidence. They should be acutely aware of human fallibility, most notably their own, and appreciate that people who disagree with them are not necessarily stupid or evil. Accordingly, they should appreciate the value of trying to change minds by persuasion rather than by intimidation or demagoguery. I believe, and I believe I can persuade you, more to the point, that the more deeply a society cultivates this knowledge and mindset, the more it will flourish. This also means, in my view, that we should resist periodic demands that a university should throw its symbolic weight behind some moral or political cause by issuing affirmations of certain political beliefs or boycotting or disinvesting in certain companies or countries. A university should be a forum in which ideas are to be studied, evaluated, and debated. It has no mandate to ratify the beliefs of a subset of its constituents, nor is it empowered to make symbolic statements, engage in political agitation, or implement economic pressure to advance those beliefs. Equally foreign to the mission of a college or university is the idea that students are to be protected from discomfort, or so-called microaggression, when they are exposed to beliefs that differ from theirs, or when the university does not accede to demands that it prosecute their moral or political crusades. Discomfort is another word for tolerance. It's the price we pay for living in a democracy and participating in the open exchange of ideas. Now, it's true that free speech has limits. As Tom mentioned in the introduction, we carve out exceptions for fraud, libel, extortion, divulging military secrets, and incitement to imminent lawless action. But these exceptions must be strictly delineated and individually justified. They're not an excuse to treat speech as one fungible good among many. Despots in so-called democratic republics routinely jail their opponents on charges of treason, libel, and inciting lawlessness. Great Britain's lax libel laws have been used to silence critics of political figures, business oligarchs, Holocaust deniers, and medical quacks. Even Oliver Wendell Holmes' famous exception to free speech, falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater, is easily abused, not least by Holmes himself. He coined this meme in a 1919 Supreme Court case that upheld the conviction of a man who distributed leaflets encouraging men to resist the draft during World War I, a clear case of expression of opinion in a democracy. So in sum, I hope to have persuaded you that protection of free speech is inherent to reasoned discourse and essential to the acquisition of knowledge, to the flourishing of a humane democracy, and to the mission of higher education. And if you object to these arguments, if you want to expose a flaw in my logic or a lapse in my accuracy, it's the right of free speech that allows you to do so. Thank you very much. Thank you. Disagreements, questions? Yes?
I have a question about what you were saying about recognizing your own fallibility. And something I've observed happening, especially in the academic sphere, is that you'll have people ideologically on the left who will attack others with the fervor of a fundamentalist Christian or a fundamentalist of any religion. They seem to think their views are infallible and they are a true believer, and you are resisting that. And I've had trouble wrapping my head around that, because at the same time, often people in academia will come at you from a point of, we're the intellectuals, we don't, I get the sense that they wouldn't see themselves as associated with a religious fundamentalist. And I'm curious about your observations of that type of phenomenon.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. It's a scandal. And I occasionally have friends who are not in universities who say, kind of ironically, I don't know how you can stand it in a university. You just can't say anything you want. You always have to walk on eggshells out of fear of expressing some dangerous opinion. These are people in the world of business and literary agent and investment. We can say whatever we want. You guys can't. Now, this is a tremendous irony because it's supposed to be the reason that taxpayers support these institutions and alumni and alumni is that it's considered a social good for ideas to be thrown out, evaluated, the bad ones criticized. And I also agree that it's, although I think there is certainly political correctness on the right, but because surveys show that overwhelmingly professors and students at the elite colleges and universities lean quite leftward. It's the left-wing brand of intolerance is more acute, at least in these forums. I mean, I think the right-wing version is more of a problem in government and in certain broadcast media, where there's also intolerance for discordant beliefs. But it's here on our own turf, we have to be concerned with the version that, for no particularly good reason, tends to be associated with the left. I mean, it's really, I think it's a disappointing and sad commentary that free speech has gotten the brand of a right-wing issue. Now, why should that be? There's no, by definition, it's just free speech, whether it's from the right or from the left. But people who defend and extol free speech, tend to be branded as right-wingers because of this, I think what you correctly identify as an ironic intolerance. I sometimes refer to the mythical place called the left pole. Now, just as when you're at the North Pole, all directions are south, the left pole is the mythical spot from which all directions are right. So any opinion that does not conform to this orthodoxy is branded a right-wing opinion, including people who are, by no stretch of the imagination, ideologues of any sort, including right-wing ideologues. So I know that you had recently Christina Hoff Sommers speaking in this same forum, and she's often branded as someone on the right, even though there's nothing particularly right-wing about her, other than the fact that she disagrees with a particular kind of orthodoxy. So that is, I think, to our shame as academic scholars and professors that that free speech should itself be politicized when it should be prior to any political discussion in the first place. Yeah.
You mentioned that disinvestment with fossil fuels would be something that's not the responsibility of the university.
Yeah.
Who would that be the responsibility of?
Well, it would be it's not clear that disinvestment is the best way of addressing climate change. That itself ought to be a subject of debate. Since for the foreseeable future, we're going to be dependent on fossil fuels. They're illuminating this very room. They're amplifying this mic I got here thanks to a hunk of metal that's fueled by fossil fuels. The problem is not that there exist companies that give us exactly what we want, namely fossil fuels. It's a collective action problem in which one has to, I would argue, we have to change the incentives that now militate toward fossil fuels and will for another, realistically, couple of decades. We have to change the incentive structure so that we shift away from carbon-intensive fuels, and that means something like a phased-in global carbon tax. But demonizing Exxon, when Exxon is giving us exactly what we want, strikes me as a completely ineffective tactic in combating climate change, because it seems to me to pander to our desire to find demons, for any problem, to identify bad guys and to try to stigmatize and punish them. Now, sometimes there are bad guys. I think that, I think Hitler was a bad guy, and I think Assad is a bad guy, I think Putin is a bad guy. But not all problems come from attacking bad guys. The problem with fossil fuels is one that carbon is really good stuff. I mean, it makes cars go, it heats things, it lights things, it's responsible for lengthening lifespans. We got a problem that we're pumping too much of it into the atmosphere. This is not Exxon's fault. It's a dilemma that we're faced with, where the two directions of solution, at least in my opinion, are a global carbon tax that would create massive incentives worldwide to try thousands of different steps, each one of which we don't know a priori what they're going to be, but it allows the whole world really to experiment with different trade-offs, all of which are tailored to the one goal that we should agree on is worth pursuing. And also, I think there is a role for public funding of technologies that are unlikely to be funded by the private sector, but that could make a big difference in transitioning to a low-carbon economy. Things like a new generation of nuclear power that's safer than the 1950s technology that we're stuck with now. Perhaps other carbon mitigation techniques like planting forests, carbon sequestration, technologies that are probably too intensive to be worthwhile as R&D projects of particular companies. So I would argue those are the two ways that we should look at climate change. Yes?
So you just gave this great talk at the speech. You just gave a great talk at the speech.
Thank you.
And I'm wondering, for lack of better words, my friend in high school always called you the psychology guy. So I'm wondering if there are any specific academic or research experiences that sort of have have pushed you to have this view?
Some, although it's a view that it's kind of prior to psychology or almost anything else, but there are some. One of them is when you're a psychologist, you become acutely aware of human cognitive and social limitations, biases, susceptibility to fallacies. There is a well-documented natural tendency to moralize your own beliefs and to stigmatize those of the people you disagree with. And to act, so we all believe that we ourselves, each one of us, is honest, attentive to facts, rational, and the people we disagree with are insensitive to facts, unreasonable, emotional, ideological. Now, we can't all be right, at least not all at the same time on the same issue. And that means you have to look to try to transcend your own convictions and say, well, what would be the kind of forum in which each of us, flawed as we are, could collectively arrive at correct and defensible beliefs, given that each one of us individually is just going to push for our own pet idea. As one psychologist put it, we are really not intuitive scientists. We're intuitive lawyers. We defend a position. We allocate all of our intellectual energy to proving that our client, namely our beliefs, are right. We try to discount contrary evidence. Now that doesn't necessarily doom us to folly and superstition if you set the right ground rules, the first of which is free speech. Most people in any given issue are going to be biased, deluded, dogmatic, ideological, but at least if you get all of the dogmas out there, you might find that one of those dogmas actually is true. So that's certainly one. The intersection between where kind of psychology leaves off and sociology begins, namely, when does one opinion become a stifling consensus? Often beliefs that very few individuals hold, but they mistakenly believe that everyone else holds. This is kind of the opposite side of common knowledge is a kind of false common knowledge, as in the well-documented phenomenon of fraternity binge drinking, where if you interview every member of a fraternity, everyone says, well, I think that drinking until you puke and pass out is really stupid and disgusting, but all of my fraternity brothers think it's really cool. And you interview every one of them, and no one actually believes that it's cool, but everyone believes that everyone else believes that it's cool. And there's some reason to think, I briefly mentioned the sociologist Michael Macy. I'm kind of a mathematical sociologist running little computer simulations of societies. He's also done some experiments on how you get this kind of false consensus where people mistakenly think that everyone believes something when no one does. And he shows that there are certain conditions of punishing minority views that can lead to ideas becoming entrenched when very few, or if anyone, actually believes them. So that's kind of it's social science. It's where individual beliefs, when we interact, do or do not become kind of stifling conventional wisdom. So that's another area that's relevant. Yes.
Hi, so I just wanted to ask about what you thought of freedom of speech in terms of social media and online. So there's a lot of instances where you see students posting whatever they want on Twitter or Facebook, and that affects a certain other student in a way that affects their mental health, which leads to bullying, which leads to committing suicide, and etc. So I wanted to get your opinion on where you draw the line between freedom of speech and hate speech.
Yes. So I think there's a distinction between what a government can criminalize, what a university or college can criminalize, and what is morally defensible. That is, there are some things where, even though I don't think governments should put people in jail for doing it, I think people should stop doing it. And that's an important difference. In the case of, there are already cases where I tend to sympathize with certain kinds of restrictions on very narrow categories of speech, like death threats. I mean, it seems to me our existing law makes a death threat a case of, I believe, a lawyer can correct me if I'm wrong, counts as a case of assault, and you can be put in jail for making a death threat for good reasons. But other cases of just making someone feel bad, like, you're a moron, you loser, I think that it's people who make that kind of comment ought to be criticized. They can often be severely criticized and attacked, but it should not be criminalized. Now, there's a whole other issue of, or not a whole other, related issue of what social media and those of us who use social media can do to elevate the quality of discourse on social media. So it's not, because I think there's another case where the border between psychology and sociology, between what one person does and what tends to happen in collective settings, is something we don't really understand. And what it is about the rules of many social media that the lowest common denominator gets free rein, and that you get abusive, personalized insults, often vulgar, occasionally violent, is something that I think that both the people who run Twitter and Facebook and the people who use it ought to think about. And there is a movement to create new social media forums that would allow free speech, but at the same time exert some quality control, so that the catcalling and the trash talk from the trolls does not get an advantage as it does now. Those are the things that often get the upvotes on these forums, just because they're so outrageous. Then people who agree with them will give them a like or give them an upvote. But changes to the rules of the forum could make it so that they are more civil spaces. And again, there's nothing wrong with doing that, with trying to shape the quality of discourse. We do that all the time. We do it with peer review in journals and standards of civil discussion in a classroom. But that's very different from having police handcuff someone and haul them off to jail if they say something that crosses a line. But anyway, it is a profound question, but I think it's just important to keep those two issues separate. Yes?
Could you say a little bit more? 30 years ago, nobody talked about trigger warnings or microaggressions. What's happened in the last decade, in your mind, that has contributed to those things coming to the fore in the way that they have?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of this started with I actually haven't studied the history of it myself, so I'm relying on my own kind of recollection, having lived through it. A lot of these are outgrowths of movements that originally were completely legitimate. Namely, like when I was a child, even a teenager, it was perfectly acceptable to tell ethnic jokes. You could hear them on the radio. Polish jokes, for example. And before my time, but I guess when I was a child, African Americans were excluded from campuses. Women were the butt of sexual insults and jokes when they did set foot on a campus like MIT. And there was a legitimate movement to remove these kinds of crude barriers to full participation of stigmatized groups. Gay people as well, where there were, those of us who are above the age of 50 can remember, limp wrist jokes and, lisping imitations of gay people and so on. And so there was some increase in decency that made those kinds of demeaning remarks and discriminatory policies no longer acceptable. But often movements kind of reach their decadent phase, where they, having achieved the majority of their goals, having picked the low-hanging fruit, they don't go out of business, but they need to find increasingly obscure grievances and causes to retain their moral franchise. And I suspect that's what happened to what we now call political correctness, many aspects of which, in their original moderate form, were completely reasonable. I talk about this a little bit in The Better Angels of Our Nature in talking about the various rights revolutions that began with the Civil Rights Revolution in the late 50s. That time after time you see what starts out as an understandable and defensible and desirable moral movement just go completely overboard, having achieved its major goals. So another example, which doesn't involve political correctness, but involves another kind of madness, is our treatment of children. So children, those of us who've read Oliver Twist and so on know how children used to be treated in the 19th century. They were, they were put to work as coal miners and chimney sweeps and starved in orphanages and so on. Then there was a kind of a children's rights revolution, where children were treated, in the words of one economist, as economically worthless, emotionally priceless. So that's our new understanding of children, as opposed to economic resources to be, exploited. And that led to a lot of great reforms: child labor laws, compulsory education, and child welfare agencies. It led to a reduction of corporal punishment of children, of spanking. Led to a greater attention to children's safety, like car seats, and not exposing kids to secondhand smoke, and playground equipment that led to fractured skulls. But now we've gotten to the point, as any parent knows, in fact, as any grown-up child knows, where parents won't let children out of their sight, where kids can't walk to school, where they can't play by themselves in the playground out of fear that they might fall or get insulted or get abducted by sex perverts, all of it totally out of proportion to any assessment of the objective risks. But the hyper-parenting movement is an example of a progressive trend that just went too far. And I suspect that a lot of this stifling political correctness comes from genuine liberation movements and rights movements that also went too far. Yes?
Okay, let's see if I got this. In the aftermath of Charlie Hebdo, American media showed a reluctance, in most cases outright refusal, to show the covers that had been so controversial.
Yeah.
Especially in stark contrast to European media that generally was more willing or more able to show those, despite in Europe, free speech, they criminalized hate speech basically. So I was wondering if you thought maybe that was some kind of part of a trend in America that kind of, it's not necessarily inhibiting free speech, but I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think you raise a profound question, and you're right at the sense of paradox that by many measures, the United States has far stronger protections of free speech than most European democracies, although on this particular issue it seemed to go the other way around. I don't know how many mainstream European papers republish the Charlie Hebdo cartoons, but certainly no American one. Oh, actually, is that true? I don't know, I haven't surveyed enough of them to know. So you can see the squeamishness of an editor who doesn't want to put his or her own writers and reporters under mortal threat. But at the same time, they certainly are newsworthy. You certainly can't appreciate the entire story unless you see them for yourself. And so they really, by standards of not kind of prurient interest, but literally understanding the source of the events of the day, it's highly relevant to see what provoked them. There's one suggestion from Timothy Garton Ash that there be some website in which these controversial material of any nature can be posted that's kind of one click away from a newspaper article. So there's a bit of kind of plausible deniability on the part of the news agency. They provide the link, but they don't host the cartoons themselves. So I don't know if that's the best compromise. I mean, if it's kind of considered a permanent feature of newspapers, it almost legitimates this kind of intimidation. Like, this is the site that we've set up so that we can be intimidated out of showing anything on our main site. But on an ad hoc basis, like, just this once and we don't know what we'll do next time, it may not be an unreasonable compromise. It's kind of like other newspapers do refrain from posting certain other kinds of material, sexually explicit material, for example, nudity and bare breasts or genitalia. You won't find that in the New York Times, even when it might be relevant. Janet Jackson, we didn't really see the offending frame of film, the wardrobe malfunction. The New York Times wouldn't publish that. So it could fall under that kind of discretion. But I think in this case, it is relevant enough that there ought to be a way in which people could see it for themselves. Yes?
Thank you for your talk. I've been teaching here for almost 30 years, and this last maybe 6 months or a year where the world seems to go in flames, I am concerned by the indifference of my students, by the indifference that a young man, a pilot, is burned by ISIS. People are being decapitated. Copenhagen, like Tom mentioned, grandparents, and no one wants to talk about it. It's puzzling that Israel is always targeted as the Zionist enemy, but no one says anything about the ideology of genocide that defines ISIS. And you spoke, so you are a psychologist and a philosopher, but how do I teach empathy? How do I teach my students that the pain of others is as important as our pain? And how do we deal with a community that when the students commit suicide, they're afraid to use the word? So today I felt, not only because of the snow, but I wanted to move back to California or to Chile, where I'm from. But I am so stunned by the silence and by the indifference of the college that I work. And I'm stunned by the lack of empathy towards the barbarism that the world faces. So I don't know, this is maybe my own reflection, but I wanted to share it with you.
Mm-hmm. Well, a few things. One is, as horrific as the events in the news of the last year are, there were plenty of horrific events through the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s as well, not least in Chile. In fact, Chile would be a perfect example of a country that had its own atrocities, not necessarily decapitations, but there certainly were mutilations and tortures during the Pinochet regime, and the country put it behind it. So we don't read about atrocities in Chile anymore. We do read about the atrocities that do take place, and I think that gives us a distorted view of the world, simply because there are always going to be some atrocities, and the news will always report them once that occur. It's only when you count up how many atrocities there are now and how many there used to be, that you get a more accurate picture of the way the world is heading. And I've argued both in my book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, and then in a follow-up article called The World is Not Falling Apart, that the world is not falling apart, that actually the trend, most of the trends, all of the trends over the span of decades are actually positive, that despite the horror of ISIS and the Syrian civil war, that has caused a local reversal in the death toll from war. But if you look at the curve since World War II, kind of has ups and downs, but overall is downward. And what the Syrian civil war, including ISIS, has done is it's led to a little uptick in the last 3 years, one that's kind of wiped out the last 10 years of progress. But even with the Syrian civil war, we're much better off now than we were in the 1990s, 1980s, 1970s, and so on. There were horrible wars going on there that were not as thoroughly reported. People didn't have smartphones. Precisely because we did not have quite the sense of empathy then than we do now, we just didn't care as much about a lot of the victims. I mean, Africa was in flames in the 1970s. There were wars like in Angola and Mozambique and in what used to be called Biafra that killed certainly on the scale of Syria, perhaps more so. But, you know, you just didn't read every day about atrocities in Mozambique. Now I think you would, precisely because the expansion of empathy, that African lives matter, is more with us now than I think it was even 30 years ago. So there are two other questions. One of them is, how does our sense of empathy get expanded? And this is a topic that I dealt with in quite a bit of detail in Better Angels of Our Nature. And again, I was asked, what does a psychologist have to contribute to this debate? So there is a literature on the psychology of empathy. And there are a number of things that can expand our circle of empathy outward. One of them is experiencing first-person accounts from the people that otherwise we would not identify with. It's easy to empathize with, you know, cute little babies and puppies and kittens and our own blood relatives. So we have we easily have a capacity for empathy. The hard part is, how do we apply the empathy that we instinctively apply to kittens and babies to not so attractive adults, perhaps of a different race and country? And there, reading first-person accounts, literature, fiction, journalism can help. Feeling that one is in a coalition with them, that we're all on the same side, we're all Americans, at least in the case of extending empathy within the boundaries of the country, or we're all human beings. Changing the basis of, the ideological basis of morality and value, so that what counts as the ultimate good is the flourishing of sentient beings, starting with humans, rather than the glory of the nation or the religion or the race or the social class. So kind of a counter-ideology to parochial ones that deliberately hem in the circle of empathy to some group, but are more universalist, more humanistic. And then also I think free speech has a role in this, because parochial beliefs are ultimately incoherent. They don't stand up to scrutiny. So if I say, I'm special, or my country is special, I can do that if it's only me speaking and I don't have to defend it. But if someone else says, well, why are you special? Why is your country special? And I say, well, I'm special because I'm me and you're not. That sounds pretty stupid. And likewise, if it's because it's my country, you can get away with that in your own country. It's harder to get away with that if you're talking to someone from another country. And so expanding the forum of ideas will naturally expand, if not empathy as an emotional, kind of touchy-feely, oxytocin-fueled welling up of emotion, but at a more cognitive level of, should we count the lives of other people the same way we count our own lives? And so universalism, I think, is a force that militates toward at least cognitive empathy, if not emotional. I think it's not a coincidence if you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is, a pretty good statement of what counts. And there's a reason that it's not arbitrary what's in it. because everyone had to agree on it. As soon as you impose that restriction, that everyone has a say, as long as they can argue their case, then a lot of things almost have to go in, and a lot of things couldn't possibly go in. So let's say Eleanor Roosevelt in the late 1940s said, well, I propose that the first article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is that everyone must avow that Jesus Christ is our Savior and he will redeem us from original sin. Well, that would kind of be a non-starter, because then, the Hindus wouldn't sign on, and the Chinese wouldn't sign on, and it's kind of dead on arrival. As soon as anyone who is capable of arguing with you gets a say, that kind of pushes you to, well, what do we have in common? We're all human beings. We all suffer. We all bring up children. We all were children. We all have to eat. And that universalizing of the forum of discussion itself forces the belief system to be more humanistic. Yeah.
First, thank you very much for a very interesting talk.
Thank you.
I greatly enjoyed it. It's important, but I would like, if I may, to take the devil's advocate and challenge you in one particular issue. So I wonder why really free speech is so important, because it is, after all, it has a meaning when you have critical thinking associated with that. If anybody is free to say anything without being able to argue and persuasively about their opinion, is not that important. The problem is that requires a lot of effort from the humans. And thinking, and it's something that takes a lot of our energy. I mean, it exhausts us. We just sit in these chairs for an hour and we're already tired, we don't move, right?
Yeah.
On the other hand, if you do not have to actually apply logic and critical thinking, it's much more pleasurable. It's nice to believe that Gemini go very nicely with Sagittarius, except when Venus is, and I can tell you about that. So I wonder why, humans are not logical creatures, are creatures that they can show that they can be logical when they take a math test, but most of our other times we do not do that, we just are emotional. And as you mentioned, if we feel that something is right, then that's right.
Yeah.
So you mentioned also that for millennia, for lots of years, humans did not believe in exactly that, and they were happy as far as we know.
No.
At least a good chunk of them.
Not the ones who were burned at the stake, and yeah, right.
No, but the rest
Yeah.
were. They did quite well. After all, we are in a corner of the universe, in a corner of many universes, and we're completely, meaningless as creatures. Why should we care?
Yeah. Well, I would, a couple things. First of all, I would challenge the idea that hundreds of years ago everyone was happy. The people who wrote stuff that survived to the present were probably happier than the typical peasant who, sort of subsisted on gruel, worked from sunrise to sunset, and died at 40, and saw a majority of their children die in the first year of life. So actually, I think probably for most of human history, most people were pretty miserable. And we're happy now, partly because of advances of science, public health, which were enabled by free speech. But I agree with you that it is hard work to advance intellectually defensible ideas. I see that as one of the reasons to favor free speech. Namely, it's easy to fall back on comfortable groupthink if you can wall off uncongenial opinions. And I see this in myself. It's really enjoyable to read something that agrees with you, and it's really annoying to read someone who disagrees with you, especially if they have a good argument. So the challenge is and again, I think this is part of the mission of higher education, to get people used to the idea that some unpleasant things are very, very good, including hearing the opinions of people you disagree with. So in the same sense that, working out on a treadmill and avoiding, favoring broiled fish over pizza, pizza tastes really good, but we can exert the self-control not to eat too much of it, sometimes. And so just being with like-minded ideologues also feels really good, but an enlightened, educated person knows that you should avoid the temptation. And in a sense, free speech is succumbing to the temptation. It's kind of intellectual junk food. It's kind of succumbing to the temptation to make life pleasant by being intellectually lazy and only hearing from people you agree with. And I agree that it feels really good, but then we can all realize that it's not very good for us, and so push back. Yes?
This is sort of just a question about classified documents and how you feel about leakings, and if you think there's ever, I guess, a line to draw about giving up the right to freedom of speech if you are in the military and that sort of thing.
Yeah, there has to be such a line. And I mean, the idea that everyone should have the right to leak anything they want is nuts. And I think there's been a surprising lack of serious critical thinking about the WikiLeaks phenomenon. Not everyone who gets a paycheck from the government should be empowered to decide what the entire world should know. For the same reason, I mean, it's ironic that the privacy debate goes in both directions. Like, my email should be sacred and no one should have the right to read it. But the Secretary of State, it's okay if I broadcast, his email or her email to the world. And human social functioning is impossible if everything is out in the open. People who work in government really do have the right to be able to trade insults and snarky remarks and humorous asides with the expectation that it's not going to be broadcasted across the world. On the other hand, democratic governments serve at our pleasure. We empower them to have police and armies that threaten us with violence. And so we do have some right that communications be open unless there's a good reason to conceal them. So I think there's no simple answer to the question of government secrecy. It can't be that governments just get to classify anything they want, nor can it be that anyone can leak anything. And I think it's not going to be easy to find where that line is, but I think that line has to exist. Yes?
I understand from your terrific argument why it is so important for us in the college and university to value freedom of speech, but doesn't the university also depend upon, doesn't it require limits on free speech also? For instance, in the classroom, I shouldn't, or maybe you think I should be able to speak to the students about why they should vote for Obama rather than McCain in the election, why U.S. foreign policy in this or that area is so outrageous and immoral. Maybe the classroom teacher, by the very nature of his or her work, should operate under some constraints. Maybe even you or I visiting a junior faculty member's classroom might find that teacher's presentation terrifically interesting and well-researched, but in an intellectual sense narrow-minded because it doesn't do full justice to the topic, to the problem that he or she's exploring. I guess a little bit I'm asking you to say more about that line that's come up once or twice.
Yeah, no, there is. So I take free speech first and foremost as the freedom from coercion and armed authority to punish speech. So there's the first principle is whether you can be jailed, fired, punished, executed, and so on for something that you say. Beyond that, there's the question of what is it advisable to say and what kinds of things do we want to encourage. And you're right that is a squishier notion and one that's going to have some gray areas. So in a university, because we have standards of intellectual quality, you're supposed to be able to defend your opinions. We don't want science professors teaching, astrology and homeopathy and pyramid power and crystals and so on. We don't want Nazi tracts or Ku Klux Klan manifestos to be presented as fact in political science courses, as opposed to documents that might be studied. So this set of softer criteria for what do we want to encourage as a very special forum for speech, namely the university, as opposed to the internet as a whole, does bring in a set of considerations that are not the same as when speech should be criminalized or not. Now, as such, there has to be a certain amount of latitude simply because no one can a priori say what a professor or a student may or may not say, together with some guidelines as to what is consistent with the overall mission of the university or college. So propagandizing in a opinion where there's a range of respectable opinions is something that we ought to discourage, at least if there is no opportunity for students to disagree or hear opposing viewpoints. Not in the sense of firing someone who tries it, but in not rewarding it, not praising it, feeling free to criticize it, trying in as much as is possible to minimize that kind of discourse over the kind that is more consistent with the mission of a university or college. Where that mission is not prosecuting a particular political position when there's a range of reasonable alternatives, but providing the forum in which those can be debated and evaluated. So admittedly, it's not a simple answer to the question, but it's separate from the criminalizing or ruling out of bounds. And it's one that we should have, and one where the criteria should be how best can we evaluate the ideas in general, rather than allowing universities to be a kind of soapbox for particular opinions. Yeah.
When answering the question about government leaks and things like that, I heard you say, and paraphrasing here, that a government that's completely transparent is not optimal.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
Can you defend that position?
Yeah, just because human cooperation depends on some degree of confidentiality. We don't allow tax records to be leaked. We don't allow military secrets to be leaked. And it's just in the nature of social interaction that certain things can be said in confidence that would be highly damaging if made public. Just imagine how long you could go through a day if everything you said to your boyfriend, girlfriend, co-workers was immediately broadcast. It would kind of bring social life to a halt. So given that reality of social life, and I've actually written about why it is that there are certain things that when kept private have a different status than when made public, since it's just a prerequisite to getting anything done when people work in groups, then there can be I think there should be some reasonable expectation that when the Secretary of State and her chief aides have a conversation, it is not immediately broadcasted. Now there could be, again, I don't think it's going to be a simple principle, because there could be an argument that these records be available to future historians after some amount of time has passed. But how do you have a conversation on how to deal with Putin if that conversation is instantly made available to Putin, and to everyone else? It's just not the way human cooperative decision-making can proceed.
Wouldn't that encourage free speech from what you're saying? If everybody knows what everybody else knows, then...
Wouldn't it encourage free speech? Well, I don't think so. I mean, not in the sense of encouraging the existence of forums in which controversial ideas can be broached. I mean, free speech doesn't mean that everything that anyone says should be broadcast to the whole world. So if that's what free speech is, then I'm against free speech, but I don't think that's what free speech is. That is, I think there is such a thing as confidentiality. I think two friends are allowed to exchange emails without it being broadcast, and I don't think it's an infringement of free speech. So I think there is a coherent concept of privacy, with the proviso that democratically elected governments are responsible for their citizens, and so it can't be used as a cover for governments to make decisions that are not ultimately under checks and balances of the electorate.
What about people like Snowden who reveal government breaching that security, breaching the privacy that you're talking about?
Well, there's a question of civil disobedience, namely, are there cases in which reasonable laws that are reasonable in general, may be broken in a particular instance for some higher principle. And there's a body of civil disobedience ethics that, I'm not an expert on, but my understanding of that literature is that in those cases, the morally courageous person is nonetheless liable for the consequences, but that those consequences should not be enforced as severely if the motivation was ultimately altruistic and reasoned. So again, it's not, so likewise, can you disrupt traffic for a protest? Well, you can, but you have every reason to think that you might be hauled off to jail. On the other hand, a judge probably shouldn't sentence you to 5 years, given that it was a legitimate political protest. So there's this weighing of two goods that can't be perfectly satisfied at every case, and that have to be adjudicated with some intermediate coherent policy. Yeah. But I don't see how you could have a policy where anything that anyone says is immediately made public, including confidential or private conversations among members of government figuring out strategies. And there may be some, legal scholars might be, in fact, legal scholars ought to craft guidelines that simultaneously satisfy the demand that governments be accountable with the demand that that no one can accomplish anything without some degree of privacy.
I just wanted to speak up because his question brought up something that I was surprised to not hear, and that was the fact that free speech has to be voluntary. And I was surprised that you didn't discuss that. And I was just wondering if you had any comments.
What do you mean by that?
Well, like, for example, we would probably all agree that an expert would have a duty to weigh in on the public discussion of something if he has some particular knowledge on it. But if an expert was pressured to speak, then that's no longer free speech. That
You mean if there's coercion?
The person, yeah.
Yes.
But not what to say, but just to say. The participation itself has to be completely voluntary. And if you are broadcasting private conversations, that's an involuntary publication of private speech. And it's not free speech.
There is, yes. I would.
I don't know what the experts say on this.
Yeah, how to craft a policy that would.
If it's free speech, then the speaker is intending for a wide audience to be hearing.
Yeah, how to state the right to privacy in a way that doesn't run afoul of right to free speech would be a challenge, but I don't think an insuperable challenge. There will inevitably be gray areas, and that's why we have judges and courts and so on to come down one way or another when something falls in the gray area. But the fact that there is a gray area doesn't mean that there isn't also a white area and a black area on either side of the gray. And it would require some intellectual subtlety and probably trial and error feedback from what can be abused in order to end up with the best policy. But I think, incumbent on a democracy to come up with a coherent policy.
Time for one more question. So, one of the things that I found interesting when we talk about free speech is, for a long time, lots of different groups have had more rights to free speech than others. Right? There's differential access based on capital.
There's what? There's
Differential access based on capital, and this, or access to infrastructure, or so on and so forth. And those differentials still exist today to a certain extent, and so I'm wondering what you think about how to rectify those differences, because certainly your law was predicated on the idea that everyone has the same access to free speech, which is not necessarily true. So how does one rectify?
Yeah. Well, I think that's another issue that clearly not everyone has equal access. We don't want everyone to have equal access. I really don't want to listen to the bore at the end of the bar with his conspiracy theories and so on. Nor do I want the government putting the bore at the end of the bar behind bars because he's starting to annoy me. So I think these are separate issues. That is, what can be criminalized and punished, whether by governments or within the community of a university or college by their own internal proceedings, and how we can get a diversity of views out there. The second, more of a technological problem than a legal problem. How do we prevent particular organs of expression from being dominated by some narrow subset of opinions, given that we have reason to believe that there are other opinions of equally high intellectual merit that are not being voiced. Certainly the internet has undoubtedly helped, for better or worse. More people can reach more other people than ever before. The challenge is, how do we maximize both the ability of minority opinions to be heard with some kind of quality control, so that the best ones, based on their merits, are sifted out of the huge amount of chatter and babble and trolling.